Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Good
So wonderful
evening.
to see everyone here. We'll give it another moment or two for people to trickle in, but welcome. Wanted to get us kicked off right this evening with a beautiful song from Nina Simone, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. So I would highly recommend, if you missed the beginning of that, to go back and listen to Nina Simone, To Be Young, Gifted, and Black. So, and that's what we are honoring, recognizing, listening into, learning from today, celebrating the beauty and the giftedness and the wisdom and the glory of the divine that is revealed in Blackness and Black people, in Black culture, in Black churches and Black theology. And so that's where we're starting with that song. So I see we still have a couple more people trickling in. We'll get started in a moment, but welcome everyone. So glad to see everyone here. Okay. All right. Let's go ahead and get started then. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Klakowski. I am the ministerial intern at First Parish in Lincoln. And I work with the Adult Programs Committee as well. And part of what I do at First Parish is think about different kinds of programming that we can offer to our congregation and to the local community and beyond, in terms of how we can grow, we can challenge ourselves, how we can be inspired, how we can connect with one another. And so in planning this particular program, my thought was, we talk a lot about, we have a really rich history in God Talk at First Parish, and it looks a lot of different ways, right? And I titled the series God Talk, first of all. So God Talk is just another way of saying theology, but it might be a little bit more approachable than theology. All theology means is God, theos, and logos is word, talk, communication. So it's how you talk about God, but not even just God in the essence of some kind of external being out in the universe, but it's questions around meaning. How do human beings make meaning in the world? How do we understand what we're here for? What are we doing here? Where are we going? How do we connect with one another? All of these are questions that God Talk or religion seeks to answer. And there's a long and rich history of that at First Parish. And my question was, how do we expand our understanding of God Talk by maybe decentering the ways in which we've already spoken about God and the answering of these questions, and recentering the ways in which other communities and other peoples have answered those questions. And so this series is getting kicked off by focusing on God Talk that has come from marginalized, oppressed, and the poor communities that have not been in the center, and communities that have not been in the dominant place in the society that we live in today and have lived in over the course of hundreds of years, this society that has developed. So we are starting today with Black theology, not just because we are now currently in Black History Month, but we are starting with Black theology because it kind of kicks off this new way of thinking about God and a new way of thinking about Christian theology that started in the 60s and 70s. There's this wave of theologies of liberation that come out of it and in conversation with it. So Black theology is really a good place to start. And we're going to be in conversation with James Cone tonight, who was my theology professor at Union Theological Seminary. And if you were to ask me about who the most important theologian in my view is, I would answer James Cone. And not just in terms of who is the most important theologian that has shaped you, but also I think the most important and significant theologian of the 20th century is James Cone. And I'd love to see a show of hands. Has anybody ever heard of James Cone, read any James Cone? Anybody? No, not a lot. He's actually been in the background of a lot of stuff that you're probably familiar with and you've heard about in the news, or different people that have been influenced by him. But he's someone that you've never heard of, even though he's so has been so impactful throughout the 20th century and into today. So Raphael Warnock was a graduate of Union Theological Seminary, where I went to seminary. His doctoral dissertation advisor was James Cone. So even into this current moment, if you remember when Barack Obama was elected, he went to a church that was grounded in and founded by Black theology, whose founder and the person that was spearheading that movement of scholarly study of Black theology was James Cone. So James Cone's been shaping a lot in the world that you may not be familiar with, but hopefully tonight you'll get a little bit of a sense of who he is and where his ideas come from. So I also want to start off by saying that all God talk is contextual. So you might say, why do we need Black theology? Like, can we just have theology and have God talk? And why do we need to have Black in front of it? Why do we need to identify these different small groups where theology is happening? Why can't we all just be one group of people and have theology as one group of people? And I would say to that, like I said, all theology is contextual. And so the thing about Black theology is it's just consciously naming it. Like, this is my social location. We all answer these questions of what does it mean to be human? Who are we, right? What is ultimate reality? Where are we going? How do we live in light of, the reality around us? We all answer those questions from a context. And Black theology names that context, that we're answering those questions, those that are Black theologians, we're answering that question from the social location of being Black in a society that hates Blackness, right? And so it's important to name that, because that shapes whoever you are, and particularly if you are somebody who identifies with or fits seamlessly into the dominant way of being in a particular society, the dominant group, right? If you easily seamlessly fit into this concept of whiteness, right? If you easily seamlessly fit into a concept of maleness or heterosexuality, you are part of a dominant way of being in society, and that shapes the way you do theology as well. The thing is, because it's so dominant, it's easy for it to not be conscious. The way you answer those questions of meaning, it doesn't become conscious, right? And so the way to really push past that is to consciously identify, oh, this is who I am. This is how I'm answering these questions. How are other people answering these questions in light of the structure that I live in the society? How are other people answering those questions? And that's what we're going to be doing today, is asking, how do others answer those questions, particularly for those of us at First Parish and in Lincoln. We live in a very dominantly white context, right? And First Parish is a historically white and still predominantly white church. And so how do we push beyond ourselves? Well, first we listen to how people have answered those questions that are coming from other contexts, and then have this conversation, right? So all of that to set the stage. Black theology. So, I answered all those things. If I were to sum up what Black theology is, I would say it's God talk that addresses what the meaning of particularly the Christian religion, the Christian faith is, from the perspective of Black people struggling for freedom, right? So Black theology was born as a Christian theology. That does not mean that there are not Black theologies of other faiths, but James Cone was a committed Christian throughout his life. And it has been a predominantly Christian movement, Black liberation theology. And so Black theology addresses all of those questions about meaning, ultimate reality, how do we live, how do we be, where are we going, from the perspective of Black people who are struggling for freedom, for liberation. And it is its core element, its core thesis is that the distinct element of the Christian faith, the key meaning of the Christian faith, is that this is a faith about a God who always sides with the oppressed, who always sides with the poor in their struggle for justice, to the point that God identifies with the poor and oppressed all the way to the cross. And so we're going to get to the cross later on, but it's this idea that the poor and the oppressed, and particularly in Black theology, people who are Black in a society that is decidedly anti-Black, that is where God can be found. And God takes sides, and God has taken the side of the oppressed. So that's really the heart of Black theology. But I would want to say, before we get into James Cone and how he developed all those ideas, so that Black theology is always happening wherever Black faith is. So just Black theology didn't really start with James Cone. James Cone, he was the first to, he was the founder of the scholarly discipline of Black theology. But for centuries, Black people have been practicing faith and practicing religion. And this idea of God being with them and being on their side has been part of the movement of the Black church and back to the time of slavery and back before the Middle Passage. And so the development of Black theology in terms of where is James Cone and where are Black theologians getting their material, where are they getting their ideas, it's deeply rooted in who they are and in their history as a people. And so what they do, what Black theology really does, is it draws on the faith of the enslaved who had experienced this horrific Middle Passage, but had this memory of their African indigenous religions. They already knew God. They already had an understanding of who God was, and they had a life-sustaining faith prior to their enslavement, the trafficking of these human beings across the ocean and being put into slavery. They had a faith already. And what happens is that echo of faith and spirituality, you know, in slavery, what enslavers did is they would take people from all different areas of the African continent and not really allow people from the same area to stay together. They wanted to disrupt their society in such a way that they didn't want to have a shared common African tongue, shared common language and culture. And so they would forcibly split people apart for that reason, to disorient. So there was a difficulty to a certain degree in maintaining the culture of their unique area from the African continent. But what there still was this universal echo of a concept of a God. There is a high God who is with them. There are their ancestors who are with them. And that really bonded them together, and then combined that with this presentation that they were receiving from their white enslavers of this God who wanted them to obey their slave masters. They said, well, I already know God, right? And so my faith is already alive, and that the God that I know doesn't sound like that. And so what they would do is they weeded out the elements of the Christian religion and found the things that were resonant with them, that were liberatory to them, right? And so the key narrative that they really held on to was the Exodus narrative, right? And so here's a story that their enslavers were telling them as they're telling them all these Christian stories from the Bible. Here's a story of a people who are enslaved in a foreign land, and they are brutally mistreated. The Hebrew people are brutally mistreated by the Egyptians, and they cry out to God, and God hears their cries and sends Moses to come and lead them out of Egypt. And so this narrative of God is a God that hears the cries of the oppressed really takes hold. And so there's a lot more to say about the origins of the Black church, but that is important, I think, to situate the development of Black theology in that context, that this is not something that just happens with James Cone out of nowhere. There is a long history of the enslaved people in the United States, enslaved Black people in the United States, having these echoes of a faith that they had been brutally separated from because of their oppressors, and then their oppressors trying to tell them about God, but them actually saying, you know what, God is on our side. God is on the side of the oppressed. And we can tell even from your own text, your own story says that God is on the side of the oppressed. And so there is that movement for generations. We fast forward to the 50s and 60s and 70s. We have fast forward to the civil rights movement. So James Cone. James Cone is born in 1938 in Arkansas. He grows up in a segregated town in the Jim Crow South. And he tells stories of, his parents talking about lynchings at the dining room table. He tells stories about at night, sitting by the window, looking out the window, waiting to see if his father, hoping to see that his father comes home, and being so worried that his father would not come home because something would have happened and he would have been lynched and he would never see his father again. And that didn't happen. But this memory of the Jim Crow South is very deep entrenched in who he is. And his memory of this constant threat of terror is deeply entrenched in who he is. And the idea that he has to be submissive to the white people in his town. He's living in this segregated town, and you can't disagree with a white person. You have to live your life with this mask. He writes about it in his memoir, and I'll read a little bit from it. Let's see. He says, "Of course, I had learned as a child to wear a mask, a disguise I had perfected by the time I moved to Adrian." This is where he grows up, he becomes a professor. He goes to seminary, a predominantly white seminary at this time in the 50s, right? And he gets a PhD, becomes a professor, and now he is a professor of theology. But he had perfected this disguise of wearing a mask. "We wear the mask that grins and lies," wrote the great Negro poet Paul Laurence Dunbar in a poem I began reciting in grade school. Those words spoke to the experience of Negroes in Arkansas and the South generally, who took great risks in disagreeing with whites. When a Negro expressed an opinion that differed from a white person, the typical response was, "Are you calling me a liar, boy?" No Black person would dare contradict a white man or woman, or even a child. In their world, white was always right. Knowing that, we had to disguise our true selves in order to keep a job, stay out of jail, or even stay alive. Got one mind for white folks to see, another for what I know is me. So went a well-known Negro folk song that I often heard as I was growing up. And so here he is being shaped in this world where he has to be one person in one place and another person at home who he knows himself to be, right? Now he's a theological professor. He is called at an early age to ministry. He feels a calling to ministry at 16. He becomes a pastor, goes on and studies theology, and becomes a professor of theology rather than a pastor. And he is watching the civil rights movement unfold. And eventually, it's the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. that really pushes him over the tipping point. And finally, his recognition of, I am in this predominantly white discipline of theology. All the people that I'm studying are white theologians. All the people that I am in class with are white. All my professors are white. Most of my classmates are white. There are a couple of Black students with him. And there is never any mention of what it means or looks like to be a Black person of faith in any of the curriculum. It's nowhere, right? And he's seeing this and he's so frustrated. He's seeing the brutality that is unfolding in the civil rights movement against civil rights protesters, and his professors are not speaking to it. Christianity is not speaking to it. And he's asking, how is it that Christianity can be true, how can God be true and have nothing to say about the experience of Black people in America, right? And so it's finally the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and the deep wells of pain that erupt from the Black community after that, and from within him, and then this declaration by white America of like, you need to like basically get over it. The anger from the white community is toward these Black protesters who are so enraged at this assassination rather than really with the assassination itself. And so he, from this deep well of pain, writes his first book, Black Theology and Black Power. So I've got here, Black Theology and Black Power. And basically in his memoir, he says, when I picked up my pen to write Christianity and Black Power, which is the article that preceded the book, Black Theology and Black Power, he says, I vowed that I'd never wear a mask again when Black dignity was at stake. And so that really shines through in the work of James Cone. A lot of people don't like to read him because it's, white people don't like to read him because it's deeply uncomfortable. If you were to pick up Black Theology and Black Power, the rage is clear, right? The rage is clear and it's pouring forth from a heart in pain. And it's because he's not holding back anymore in order to make anybody comfortable. It's because he is saying, I'm not going to wear that mask anymore when Black dignity is at stake. And so he comes out with this Black Theology and Black Power. And essentially what he does with Black Theology and Black Power is because there's this question being asked, can you be Black and Christian, right? He's seeing what he was seeing as the failure of the civil rights movement at that time after Martin Luther King died, and this rise of the Black Power movement, right? As the child of Malcolm X, basically, this next step of Malcolm X, and saying, these two movements, the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement, are by white people being pitted against one another. And this happens to this day, right? In documentaries that I've been watching, I will watch a documentary about John Lewis, an amazing figure. And what happens is John Lewis ends up getting pitted against Kwame Ture or Stokely Carmichael, right? Malcolm X gets pitted against Martin Luther King Jr. And this is happening today, and this was happening in the time that Dr. Cone was writing. And so what he does is he says, we can't actually pit these two figures together against one another, because they both offer important pieces of the puzzle for Black people, right? And what he does is he says, the Blackness in Black theology comes from Malcolm X. Malcolm X said that the worst thing that white people ever did to Black people is they taught us how to hate ourselves, right? And so he says that the Blackness in Black theology comes from Malcolm X, who reminded us that we needed to love ourselves as Black people. And the theology comes from Martin Luther King Jr. And so I want to read, he later on wrote a book called Martin and Malcolm in America. I want to read from here. He says, there we go here. There we go. Martin and Malcolm are important because they symbolize two necessary ingredients in the African American struggle for justice in the United States. We should never pit them against each other. Anyone, therefore, who claims to be for one and not the other does not understand their significance for the Black community, for America, or for the world. We need both of them, and we need them together. Malcolm keeps Martin from being turned into a hapless American hero. Martin keeps Malcolm from being an ostracized Black hero. Both leaders make important contributions to the identity of African Americans, and also, just as importantly, to white America and Americans in general. So he brings these two together in this concept of Black theology, where basically what he says is that God is on the side of the oppressed. God identifies with the oppressed. And what that means in this context is God identifies with Black people. Therefore, God is Black, right? So he later on says in A Black Theology of Liberation. I'm reading a lot here, I know, but I want to get you him, right? The blackness of God means that God has made the oppressed condition God's own condition, right? So God so identifies with the oppressed that God takes on the condition of the oppressed. And that is specific in Jesus on the cross. So for Dr. Cone, his favorite book that he wrote of his is The Cross and the Lynching Tree. And basically what he does in The Cross and the Lynching Tree is says that the cross and the lynching tree interpret one another. And if you are a Christian in the United States, the cross is the central symbol of Christianity. And for a long time, the liberal white strain of Christianity has been trying to slowly but surely get rid of the cross because it's very uncomfortable to look at. It's very gruesome, right? And his whole argument here is that the cross is the central element to Christianity. And if you get rid of it because it's uncomfortable, you're missing the point. What instead we should be doing is interpret the cross through the lens of the lynching tree, in that they are both gruesome spectacle executions, and they were done in order to keep the dominating group in control and to terrorize the oppressed group. That's why those practices were done, right? And so anywhere that someone is lynched, that is a re-crucifixion, right? And so he is constantly saying that, this desire to do away with the cross is a desire for cheap grace. We want to just focus on the good and the happy, right? He calls on Bonhoeffer's idea of cheap grace and saying that we want to sanitize faith instead of saying that what God is actually about is about identifying with those crucified peoples throughout history. So the idea, he goes through in the whole book, I would highly recommend it as like a book group reading, right? That what he does is he talks about how Black people have always been so focused on the cross. The cross is still so central to their theology. If you pay attention in Black churches, the sermons go back to the cross so often. The music goes back to the cross so often. Why is there such this emphasis on the cross? And he says it's the idea that in Black churches, it's if God was on the cross with Jesus, then God is on my cross with me, right? God is with me in the crosses and the re-crucifixions that I experience as an oppressed member of this society that is being constantly targeted by the state, right? So there's a lot here. I want to leave some time for questions, but what I want to do is say that this is a very particular theology. He's very particular in talking about Blackness, that this is, that God is Black, that Jesus is Black, and he identifies the divine in that way. But he does so with the purpose of becoming universal, where he says is that if God is Black, if God is with Black people in their oppression, then God is with all people in all of their oppressions. And he consistently identifies the fact that he doesn't know what it is to be oppressed in all these other different ways, right? And so what you see if you were to read him in like Black Theology and Black Power, or Black Theology of Liberation, he uses male pronouns a lot. So he was called out early on by Black women saying, you're writing all about what it means to be Black in America and how oppression, how we experience oppression as Black people in America, but you're so male-centric in the way you write your theology. You're so male-centric. And over time, he receives this pushback from these different groups, and he says, you know what, you're so right. I'm writing this theology from the fire in my belly, from the oppression that I experience, but no one has a universal experience of oppression. I don't know what your experience of oppression is. So in order for me to be saved, salvation for him is to join with others in their oppression, the way God joins with Jesus on the cross in his oppression, and the way God joins with Black people in their oppression in the United States. And so what does that mean for white people? How do white people learn from and grow from theology? It's understanding that if God joins with and comes in solidarity with people who are oppressed, if God comes into solidarity with Black people in America, then the call for the white Christian, the call for the white church, is to follow God's lead in that way, to come into solidarity with those who are being harmed, right? And saying, your oppression is my oppression. I'm not free until you are free. And the same thing James Cone says he's called to do as a man, and to recognize, you know what, when his women students, his Black women students pushed back at him and said, you're not talking about us, he said, well, then what do you have to say? And he basically encouraged this whole growth of the movement of womanist theology, which we're going to talk about in 2 weeks, which is theology from the experience of Black women, predominantly in the United States. And so from his work with his students, there's a whole movement of womanist theology that comes forth, queer theology that comes forth. And he says, I don't have the universal experience of oppression. I'm naming the experience of Black people's oppression. And this is how I see God coming into solidarity with the oppressed. But now I'm called to come into solidarity with you who are experiencing this. So that's a little bit of Black theology. And to close out what I'm saying, I wanted to present this image of, well, you'll see. Here we have what is commonly seen as the image of Michelangelo's statue of Mary holding up Jesus, and who is after he's been crucified. And this is an image by Margot Humphrey, a Black American artist, who, in the wake of the murder of Trayvon Martin, basically reinterprets that image as Jesus as a young Black boy who has been killed in the street, holding his bag of Skittles, and Mary, his mother, is holding him. And this is the power of Black theology, I think, for us today, is that we see God coming into and being with the oppressed, the people that are experiencing these horrors, and it calls us to do something in response, right? Is if this is what Jesus looks like today, what are we called to do if you identify as Christian or Christian adjacent, right? If those are the stories that we are telling ourselves in terms of answering these questions of who we are, what does it mean to be human, what are we doing in the world, if that's our narrative and this is where God is today, then what are we called to do? Who are we called to be, particularly as a predominantly white church or predominantly white community in New England, and a very affluent part of New England? What are we called to do, right? And so this is the heart of Black theology, right? With that, I've been talking for a long time, and I wanted to stop and open it up for questions, conversation, dialogue. How does this hit you? You know, what kinds of questions come up for you? I am not a Black theology expert. I am someone who was radically reshaped and reformed by James Cone and by Black theology. He was my theology professor in my first year of seminary. And I find myself, my faith, I cannot see any meaning or purpose to faith for me outside of what this is, what he's saying. I can't see any point to Christianity apart from this message. I can't see any point to the cross apart from this message for me. And so I speak as someone who has been deeply moved by it, not as someone who is a scholar in this way. But I would love to open it up to pushback, to questions, to reflections. Where does this land for you? I see Joan's hand up.
I've heard you say in church or somewhere before that liberal, these aren't the right words, but I've heard you say something like this, that liberal churches run from, that's not the right word, the cross. Mm-hmm. And before I thought it meant from really unpleasant things, but now I understand you're saying that we run from helping the oppressed or being there as one with the oppressed. And that's very moving to me, because I do think that we need to, as John Lewis said, move our feet with our faith. So I just wanted to make sure that I was getting it right.
Yes, absolutely. I think there is a danger in erasing the cross in theology because we are uncomfortable with the unpleasantness of it. Because if we erase the unpleasant things as people who are members of the dominant group, then we erase the call to step into the situation with the oppressed, right? To come in and be a part of that fight for liberation. We are foregoing that call if we get rid of the cross, because that's unpleasantness is what, how often have we been so moved by, these videos that come up, right? Of crucifixions that are happening in the streets today, of Black men being murdered by police, right? It is a deeply uncomfortable thing to witness. I don't want to witness that, but I cannot erase it. I cannot ignore it, because if I ignore it, then I am ignoring the problem, and I am then part of the problem, right? So that's where, yes, I see RL.
So if you deny the cross and you deny the crucifixion, then you deny the risen Christ, which I think is even scarier for liberal white people. That whole thing that, oh my God, I got to grab this whole concept that it's how can I ever believe that somebody could rise and live again? So that, I think, is the scary part about the cross. It's not the crucifixion, it's what comes after. And I always recall Roger Payne's wonderful sermon one Easter that's called "And Now for the Hard Stuff," which is, okay, we've gotten this and everything's been good with them, but now we got to face this question about a resurrection. And Black churches, it's all about the resurrection. Living, he loved me. Dying, he saved me. Buried, he carried my sins all away. Yep. Rising, he justified and freed me forever. Someday he's coming back, glorious day. And that's what that's all about. Yeah.
Yeah. And Cohn goes on with this and says the whole point with the cross for Black people in America is they see that in the cross, the Roman Empire does not have the last word, right? And that the Roman Empire killed the body but couldn't kill the spirit. And we can interpret, what does it mean? What does resurrection mean, right? Physical, spiritual, whatever. But for Black people in the Black church, it's got that death doesn't have the last word, and there is hope, right? And there is resilience, right? Because God is there on the cross. The fact that God is there on the cross means that Friday's here, but Sunday's coming, right?
Sarah?
Yes, Jenny.
So I've been just reading Holocaust literature and stuff, and where is God after Auschwitz? Mm-hmm. So did Black theology ever, do they believe in a powerful, omnipotent God? And if so, why didn't God get them out of slavery? Why didn't God, like, what kind of a God? I mean, God's on the side of Black people, but what does that mean? What does God do? And yeah.
Yeah. What does God do? The answer is God was enslaved with them, right? God was there with them, and God was lynched with them, right? God was being segregated with them, and that is what is God doing? God was there, and it's, there are the layers of it, right? Because it's like, well, if God was really just, then in our minds we think God would just have ended it then, if God was really omnipotent, able to come in and end it. And that's not what the focus is. It's, the focus is
Okay,
God
on
is
imminence.
imminent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when they talk about Exodus and the Red Sea, they aren't really expecting a God who's going to come along and part the waters and save and deliver them.
Well, any day that they get through, that's God's delivering them, right? That that day is deliverance.
So they think it's God who did that.
Yes. Yes, absolutely.
But would they ask the way the Jews ask? Well, how could God possibly allow this to happen? And not all Jews, but I mean some Jews. Do you think that was a question?
That's absolutely a question. And there's absolutely tension with it, right? With Cone, I can't speak for all Black theologians. He is the key figure, and he's the one that I'm most familiar with. With Cone, his focus is absolutely God's imminence, and the fact that the imminence means that it's not going to last forever. The fact that God is here with us in this means that another day is coming. Resurrection will come because God is here in the crucifixion with us.
So even if you're sitting there in prison or Auschwitz or anywhere and you feel completely alone and everything, he would still say, well, even if you don't feel it, God is actually there with you.
I want to say, based on my understanding of Cone, that he would say yes.
Yeah.
That they can kill the body, they can't kill the spirit. God is the salvation is what's happening internally, that no matter what they do to your body, you are alive, right? They can't kill your spirit. RL, did you have your hand up again?
I just wanted to say that it's a very personal thing. It's not about the Blacks. It's about my deliverance will come. Or you can look at broader, our deliverance. But if you're in Auschwitz, that's the best you can do, is think that your deliverance might come. And so that's what your God does, is he's on your side. He will take care of you. I've never heard the whole story about why'd you do this to us and why aren't you gonna liberate? I've never heard that speak in anything I've witnessed. So
yeah. I've seen a couple interviews with James Cone. I saw an interview with him, and Bill Moyers had him on, and asked him, like, so do you still think God is love? And he's like, Cone is like, yeah, God is love. like God is love. God is the fact that I am here, and the fact that, God, liberation happened because I'm here, right? Is what his whole approach to it was. Mary, Caleb, yes.
I'm having am I unmuted? Yes.
Yes, you are.
I don't know if it was the same sermon RL was talking about, but Roger gave a couple of humdingers on the subject of resurrection and the crucifixion. And I remember one Sunday, he said, one Easter Sunday, he sort of rejected as a foundational fable the crucifixion as a story about, a gruesome story about the necessity that somebody was going to have to suffer in order for God to be revealed, and the grace of God to be made manifest, and the resurrection happened. And that I found myself nodding my head inwardly about that. Why do we need a religion that's based on this horrible idea that somebody has to die? There has to be a sacrificial victim. But what I'm thinking right now is that, wow, does it ever say a lot about white privilege that a person could even imagine a world in which there wasn't this real suffering unto death, and not just individual but widespread. I mean, that's the way the world is. It's always been that way. It was that way when Christianity was born, and I would imagine for Black people there would be no other lens through which to look at the presence or absence of God from the world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, there was pushback. Dr. Cohn had pushback, particularly from Black women, about the concept of redemptive suffering, right? That he needed to be more clear about what he meant by what was happening on the cross, because, and we're going to get into this in a couple of weeks, when womanist theology, this idea of the Black women as mules, right? Or surrogates, or like holding the work, the pain, holding the suffering of their white slave owners, their oppressors, the whole idea of Black women as surrogates, right? Really was at the core of this womanist critique of Cohn and his emphasis on the cross. And so he had to reflect and kind of reframe the way he was saying it, but he still didn't want to get rid of it, right? He was careful about saying that there's nothing redemptive about the violence, that the violence is not like, oh, God is saving humanity through this horrific act. His point is that the horrific crucifixions are still happening, right? And people are still being crucified, and I can't take away that image as long as crucifixions are still happening, right? That the cross is the religion of the poor. He talked about how the poor really hold on to the cross, right? And so he says, in solidarity with them, I can't ignore it, right?
Mm-hmm.
In one of those same sort of sermons that Mary was talking about, I remember vividly, Roger said, well, first of all, he read the passage, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And then he went on to say, my God would never do that. A light went on in my head and said, you mean you can make up what you want your God to be? There's not a given. You can make a God for yourself. That was eye-opening to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
absolutely. That was the invitation, I think, for me from Dr. Cohn and from womanist theologians to push back on the text, right? To say, I am, and that the fact that I'm pushing back on the text doesn't mean I'm throwing it away. It means I'm stepping into this lineage. I'm part of the lineage. I'm part of the conversation. So now I'm coming and entering into conversation with the text and saying, this is what this text says. I'm saying this back, and now I'm in this sort of reciprocal conversation, and God is speaking through that conversation, that push and pull, right? Anybody else have something they'd like to say?
Well,
Lorraine.
Okay, go ahead, Lorraine.
Does he mention anything about free will? Do they just believe in free will?
Yes, he does believe in free will. He does believe in free will. He does not see it. He doesn't really talk about predestination in anything that I can remember. I have not read every single one of his books. I have a good number of them. But I have read a good number of them, but he focuses on this idea that, so because God has done this, he has this entering in concept of God. God enters into humanity. God enters into the state and the plight of the poor and the oppressed. And so that is an invitation to those who are in the dominant places in society to surrender their status as dominant and to come in solidarity. And so that is you can do that or you cannot. You have the choice, you have the option, right? So absolutely, he does believe in free will. Barbara.
Well, I have a question. This term liberation theology, which I've heard for a few years, actually, it's kind of, to me, it was kind of a new concept of liberation theology, but I'm not sure I thought of it as only Black theology. But I mean, did Dr. Cohn, or is this a sort of recent way of looking at what the Black church maybe has been forever,
right?
But now liberation theology is sort of trying to bring it into the present day and have us, the white dominant culture, become part of it and understand it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Is that what, I mean, is he sort of the father of liberation theology, or what? I mean, it seems like it's been a kind of a movement for a while, right?
Yeah. So he is the father of Black liberation theology. His book, Black Theology and Black Power, was written in 1969. A Black Theology of Liberation was in 1970. And then he had The Cross and the Lynching Tree was in 2011. So his career spanned a good amount of time, and that was his, other than his memoir, I want to say The Cross and the Lynching Tree was his last book. But liberation theologies, since he wrote Black Theology and Black Power, there have been a whole variety of liberation theologies, plural, that have burst forth, right? And this has been, up until today, they're continuing to be brought into being. My master's thesis was a fat theology of liberation. So talking about what it means for God to show up in the bodies of fat people, and how do we dismantle this idea of thinness, and thinness being equated with whiteness, because fat hatred is rooted in anti-Blackness and all this. So I wrote this whole thing weaving together Black theology, womanist theology, and basically fat politics into trying to write what does it look like for God to show up, and what does it mean to be for God to be fat, right? So there are multiple theologies of liberation continuing to be born.
There was a strong one in Latin America, right, Sarah?
Yes,
Gustavo Gutierrez and Leonardo Boff and
Right.
people.
That's right.
Yeah.
Gustavo Gutierrez,
Yeah.
Theology of Liberation, and that we're going to get into in March. So this month, like I said, we're doing Black theology first, and then next session in 2 weeks, we are going to do womanist theology, kind of looking at the womanist pushback on Cone, but also just beyond that, womanist theology, looking at Alice Walker's In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, her definition of womanism. So, and then from there's much more to do, right? So there's Latinx liberation theology, which we're going to do in March. There's also eco theology that I'd like to get to, eco-womanism, queer theology, feminist theology, all kinds of different ways we can look at this and talk about it. So
they're all liberation.
But they're all liberation, yes.
They're all liberation. I just want to mention that this month they're going to have 2 programs on Channel 2 about the history of the Black Church. Henry Louis Gates is going to be the person in charge of it. And I think that would be, I definitely have it on my calendar. But I think, to see a history, and hopefully it will be well done, or to see what we think about it after today.
Yes, I was going to recommend that. I mean, I of course it hasn't aired yet. I haven't seen it, but I have it on my calendar to watch. I am very excited to watch it. So it's going to be this in-depth look at the Black Church and the history of it. I'm so excited to see how he does that. I don't think it was about that. Mary, I see.
Just a question. I can't remember the first name of the poet Dunbar.
Amanda, no.
You remember what his first name is?
Paul Lawrence Dunbar.
That's right,
Yes.
Paul Dunbar. My daughter gave me a copy, a printout of a a first edition of his poetry because he was an Ohioan, and she has been doing a lot of work with musical and literary culture in the Midwest as part of her work as a professor. But I was wondering about Black theologians. Maybe they don't give themselves this name, but are there books of sermons, collected sermons of Black ministers, or did they just not write them down? Is it more of an oral tradition that somehow has been lost?
That is a very good question. I want to say there have been those collections, but I can't think of a collection off the top of my head.
It might be just, you know, the tip of the iceberg,
so, yes.
as often happens when the tradition is so performative and, you know, so oral. But yeah, there just have to have been voices. Of course, Black orators, in some sense, were theologians too. I think that could perhaps be argued.
YouTube, Mary, you'll find all sorts of stuff on YouTube, I'm sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are certainly so many sermons on YouTube, but I'm curious about an anthology. I think that's a really good question that I'd have to look into. Yeah.
Maybe Skip Yates will enlighten us about that. He's done so much work, you know, bringing these forgotten texts to light.
Mm-hmm. Are there any other questions?
I know there are a lot of questions that are coming up in the little chat screen here of different things. Yeah, the Channel 2 thing is the 16th and the 23rd at 9 o'clock, Tuesday night.
Great.
Oh, I know. One question. Would you, if one wanted to read one of Combs' books, would you recommend The Cross and the Lynching Tree?
Yeah, I would recommend The Cross and the Lynching Tree. I would also say Black Theology and Black Power and Black Theology of Liberation. I mean, a Black Theology of Liberation is more of an academic theology text. He kind of lays out sources, norms, doctrine of God, doctrine of Jesus. Black Theology and Black Power is really good. I think it is important and it is powerful for white people to read it and to come into it with an understanding of you're probably going to be uncomfortable, right? There's going to be a way that he speaks that is very direct. He takes off the mask, like he said. He grew up in this world where you couldn't tell a white person they were wrong. And this is his moment where he says, I'm gonna be direct. And he is direct. And I think it is an important exercise for us to listen, in particular to Black people when they are speaking to us directly, as a white person, to listen to them and to come in with a spirit of humility, right? And to notice when you're uncomfortable, and to have that be a spiritual practice of humility and recognition of when you're uncomfortable, and asking ourselves, so what is that teaching me about myself, and what is this teaching me about my relationship with this person, right, and with this community, right? So I recommend it, and with the caveat that it's an invitation to a spirit of humility, right? And I think that's very important for us today. Yes, Paula.
Just one quick remark, because I remember reading quite recently the book about James Baldwin, and who was writing back in the 60s. And it was very interesting to me how very poorly his writings were received. And it was because he was such a strident Black man who did not mince words about anything. I'm kind of curious about Cone's first book, whether that first book was received well or not, because that was the time of the Black Panthers and, as you said, Malcolm X and all of those people who were so quote unquote scary to the whites that they were not listened to at all. So I'm curious about Cone at that period as well.
It was not well received by the white church. It made people very uncomfortable, very angry, and still does to this day. I mean, if you were to Google James Cone and see a lot of the responses, he is called all kinds of names because of his just, this is how it is. And he you know, he has this section where he talks about, you know, is integration the answer? Let me see this. Actually, the headline is why integration is not the answer, right? Whites are not only bothered about Black racism, but also about the rejection of integration implied in Black power. They say, now we have decided to accept the Negro, he will have no part of it. You see, we knew he really preferred segregation. What then does Black power say about integration? So he says, one Black power advocate, when a newsman asked, what about integration, responded, integration of what? The implication is clear. If integration means accepting the white man's style, his values, or his religion, then the Black man must refuse. There is nothing to integrate, right? And then he says, on the other hand, if integration means that each man meets the other on equal footing, with neither possessing the ability to assert the rightness of his style over the other, then mutual meaningful dialogue is possible. But his whole thing was with Black power was, you know, if the whole point of the civil rights movement is integration, but we're doing it on the dominant culture's terms, then that's not actual liberation, right? And so that's why he retains this concept of Black power, because it is saying we don't have to dilute any element of our Blackness, any piece of it, any piece of our culture, any piece of our language, any piece of who we are, in order to become a part of this society. You want to have a dialogue on equal footing, fine, but it's not at the cost of Blackness. He said, I was Black before I was Christian. That's what James Cone said. I was Black before I was Christian. And so that's why any request that he surrendered any of that is like, I'm not interested, right? And so that's where he's at with Black theology and Black power.
Did anybody else see the PBS special about Josephine Baker? I think it aired maybe the Sunday before last. It was, or sometime in the weekend. It was an hour-long special about the career of Josephine Baker, who was an entertainer and became an activist. And she was one of many Blacks who had to go to France to get her footing as an artist and a performer. And then she came back in the mid-30s to New York, you know, hoping to ride the train of her success, you know, onto the stage in New York. And she was rejected. And the rejection, the most common term that was used is one that we still hear, is that she had attitude. Attitude. And I have heard people using that about Black people, especially Black women. If they don't just sort of smile and make nice, they have attitude. My cousin said that, and I just about had a fit, had to repress what I really wanted to say. But that's, I mean, that sort of thing defines the whole public perception of figures like Barack and Michelle Obama and their behavior and so on. And when I think about it, I think, why wouldn't they just be seething with rage all the time? You know, a little bit of attitude seems hardly surprising, but how dare we accuse them of having attitude?
Yeah. James Baldwin said, to be Black in America and relatively conscious is to be in a rage nearly all the time.
And he went to France also to get away from America.
Yeah.
He spent a good part of his life there.
Yep.
But I do recommend the Josephine Baker special. And,
Yep.
and there was another one that also had an attitude episode in it about a brilliant Black scientist, Percy Julian, who discovered all kinds of important things. And I mean, he basically discovered cortisone. He discovered the missing link in how to make cortisone. And we're all, I mean, I have just had a cortisone shot, and he was, this is a 2-hour special. It's absolutely fascinating. The difficulties he had getting his education, getting an assistantship so that he could do a PhD, getting a job, keeping a job. And if he misspoke, he had attitude, and we don't want anyone with attitude around here. And so he basically, his whole career was derailed, and he went into industry, went to work for the Glidden Paint Company and did brilliant chemical work that way, and only incidentally was able to make those contributions relevant to medicine, for example. So PBS is doing a brilliant job now.
Yeah, I watched just last night a PBS documentary from 2011 of the Freedom Riders. There's some really great documentaries on there, but are there any other thoughts, comments, reflections before we close?
Nope, but this is a great lecture series, Sarah.
Oh,
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
for bringing this up.
I want to close with one more quote I'm going to read from Cone, and then we will head on out. He says, Martin King was right. The hour is late, and the clock of destiny is ticking out. We must declare where we stand on the great issues of our time. Racism is one of them. Poverty is another. Sexism another. Class exploitation another. Imperialism another. We must break the cycle of violence in America and around the world. Human beings are meant for life and not death. They are meant for freedom and not slavery. They were created for each other and not against each other. We must therefore break down the barriers that separate people from one another. For Malcolm and Martin, for America and the world, and for all who have given their lives in the struggle for justice. Let us direct our fight toward one goal, the beloved community of humankind. May it be so.
Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you.
Very
Thank
much.
you all, and hope to see you in
Beautiful.
2 weeks for
Beautiful
Womanism.
book.